Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Michigan Nature Association's Michigan Nature at Home virtual speaker series. We're so glad that everyone was able to join us from your homes. My name is Lauren Ross, and I am the Communications and Events Coordinator for the Michigan Nature Association. The Michigan Nature Association is the oldest statewide land conservancy in Michigan. Since 1952, M&A has protected and enhanced habitat for rare, threatened, and endangered species at our network of more than 180 nature sanctuaries, which can be found from the Ohio and Indiana borders to the tip of the Kenai Peninsula. I'm joined today by two of our regional stewardship organizers, Rob Johnston and Zach Picana, who will be helping to monitor the chat box throughout this event. We will begin in a few moments after reviewing a few of the features of the Zoom platform. There we go. As a reminder to everyone, this event is being recorded, so we have disabled participant video and audio in order to ensure that there are no distractions for others that are tuning in or viewing later. We will begin with approximately 40-minute presentation, followed by 20 minutes of Q&A with our presenter. Feel free to use the chat box to ask questions throughout the presentation, and we will do our best to get to them all during the Q&A session. If you have not used Zoom before, you are joining on a computer, the chat box will be located in your meeting controls at the bottom of the screen. If you are joining from a tablet device, the meeting controls may be found at the top of the screen. Our presenter today is James McCommons. He is a professor in the English department at Northern Michigan University, teaching journalism and nature writing. He has worked as a newspaper reporter, a magazine editor, and I lost my place, and a freelance journalist, specializing in ecology, environmental, and travel topics. He has written hundreds of general interest magazine articles and 2 books. His first book, Waiting on a Train, which chronicled a year riding Amtrak and interviewing transportation experts, was chosen by the Library Journal as one of its best books of 2009. Camera Hunter, his biography of George Shiras III, was chosen by the Library of Michigan as a Michigan Notable Book of 2020. So we're going to begin with the presentation.
Thanks for coming tonight. I appreciate you coming here virtually to hear about George Shiras III and my book, Camera Hunter. I hope you enjoy it. Most people know George Shiras through his photography, but I'm also going to talk tonight a bit about his environmental legacy because he was an important conservationist around the turn of the century. But he is best known for his photography, pictures of deer especially, but also of birds. This was a albino raccoon. He did most of his work in northern Michigan, but on other expeditions to other parts of North America as well. This was a photograph of an elk taken on Grand Island, Michigan in the Upper Peninsula, and another picture taken at Whitefish Lake in the Upper Peninsula. Now, who was this guy, George Shiras? And was he from Michigan? Actually, he wasn't. He was from Pennsylvania. He was from Pittsburgh. This is a picture of the Shiras family. This picture is entitled The Four Georges, All Sportsmen. And that is because all the people in this picture are named George Shiras. This is George Shiras Sr. to the left, George Jr. in the middle, our guy, George III, to the right, and then his infant son, George IV. The Shirases came to Pittsburgh. They were Scottish. They came to Pittsburgh right after the Revolutionary War, and they became brewers. And the family brewed beer and spirits, shipped them down the Ohio River. That was really the edge of the wilderness. As the family became more ensconced in the Pittsburgh society, as they made money, their family went into law. So George Sr. here on the left started off being a brewer. He was about the 3rd generation brewer from the Shiras family. he was able to retire when he was just in his 30s and spent the rest of his life farming and pursuing his two passions, which were fly fishing and hunting. He first came to the Upper Peninsula in 1849, and he did that to fly fish to St. Mary's River. He fished the river for a while, and then he took a steamer down the shore from Sault Ste. Marie to this place where they were just starting to hack this town out of the wilderness, which was Marquette. And he met a young man there named Peter White, who we'll talk about later. And then on that same trip, he went further on to the Keweenaw Peninsula, where he got to Fort Wilkins, what is now Copper Harbor, and found that everybody was all excited because they were pulling out, the copper miners were pulling out and headed for the California gold rush. On the way back, he stopped again in Marquette, caught a lot of fish, and decided to come back. Eventually, the Shiras family made Marquette their summer home. This is where they came every summer. Eventually, he started to bring George Jr., his son, as well, who took up his father's love of hunting and fishing. George III first came as a child when he was 10 years old. He had always heard about this wonderful place, northern Michigan, when he was a little boy. And the reason the Shirases came was not just to hunt and fish, but it was also to get out of Pittsburgh. During the Gilded Age, the 1880s, 1890s, Pittsburgh was a terrible place to be in the summer. It was known as hell with the lid off, and a lot of the richer families came to the Great Lakes to summer, and the Shirases came to Michigan or to the UP. Now, that's partly because they had made a friendship with Peter White. This is a picture of Peter White when he's older, of course. Peter White was one of the first people who came to Marquette and helped build the town. He became an important person for the town over the next 30 to 40 years. He did everything from deliver mail, start the school, start the library, start a bank. He worked for the iron companies. He speculated on land. He became quite wealthy. Again, here's a picture of the UP. We're talking about this area right here, Marquette to Munising, this north central of the UP, Lake Superior area. There's Marquette to the left, Munising to the right, US 41 in between. K.I. Sawyer Air Force Base, which of course is the county airport today. That red dot is the area of a place called Whitefish Lake, and it was there that White got control of about 2,000 acres surrounding an inland lake on the Laughing Whitefish River. And he decided he was going to make it his hunting preserve. It was his camp. Picture of the Laughing Whitefish River today, right, to the bottom of the picture. We're looking south. If you've ever been up to the Laughing Whitefish Falls site, that is sort of on the horizon there. But in between is this wide area of the river, and that's Whitefish Lake. And White owned all the land around it and access to the lake. And today it still is a private lake, and it still is in the hands of the Peter White heirs. Now, this is the first camp that they built on that lake, and as you can see, it's pretty crude. And there was a dugout canoe. It was made out of woody material that they found on site. This is a picture taken just a couple years later. This is Peter White to the second man in from the right. The two guys in the middle are two Englishmen. One of them is a lord who came to the UP to look over his iron holdings, and the rest of the men are guides that White would hire to come out and basically cook the food, guide the men into the woods, do the heavy lifting, pack out the meat. One of those guides was a guy named Jack Lapete. Jack Lapete was a French Indian man who had grown up in Sault Ste. Marie, came to Marquette, was well known in town, worked for Peter White quite a bit. He came by the hotel where the Shirases were staying and offered to take the two youngest boys hunting so they could get their first deer. That was the very first trip that George Shiras III made to the Upper Peninsula. He was just 10 years old. Lapete was a trusted friend of the family's, so Lapete took the two boys to Whitefish Lake. It took them 2 days to get out to the lake. They, when they got out there, they camped, and then Lapete taught them how to hunt, which is how a lot of the people hunted at that time, and they hunted at night. And they put a skillet onto the front of the canoe after dark. They filled it with heartwood, birch bark, pine sap, flammable material, and then they would go out at night and they would listen for a deer or some animal on the shoreline, and then they would point the canoe in that direction and then light the material in the frying pan, which would act essentially like a spotlight and hopefully would freeze the deer, and then the boys would stand up in the canoe and fire. And that's what they did, and they both got deer. And that was how a lot of people hunted at that time. This is a picture of George when he's in his early 20s, and he's bringing home a deer on Whitefish River, just at the end of the lake. This was an area they called the slough. It was the outlet of the lake. They often got deer here because there were a lot of mineral licks, and the deer would come down there. So they would go down there at night with their skillet, or later they were using kerosene parabolic lanterns. They often got a deer. Now at that time, this was not considered unsportsmanlike, nor was there really any law against it. Eventually, things did change as settlement came to the Upper Peninsula. The cabins were improved by many of the guides that had turned into workmen at the camp. Eventually, it became a place that had gardens in the front. The first time the boys went out there, they had to walk. It took 2 days. Eventually, a railroad came through to the nearby settlement called Deerton, named after the reason, because there were quite a few deer there. And they could jump off the train and then hike in. And eventually, a road was built out to the camp. And there's a road built out to that camp today, and it's called the Peter White Road. It was a place to bring the family. And the families of Peter White and many of the mine owners and the more wealthy individuals from Marquette came out there to hunt. This is a picture of the Shiras and White families. This is George Shiras in the middle. Of course, he's older at this picture. Junior to his right. And to the far left is Fanny White. Fanny White was the daughter of Peter White. George Shiras III and Fanny grew up together as young children and saw each other in the summer. They fell in love, and the rich young man from Pittsburgh married the daughter of the richest man from Marquette. So eventually the White and Shiras families weren't just friends. They were brought together through family and, of course, through children and grandchildren. Now, George became a corporate lawyer just like his father. He went to Yale, he went to Cornell. He came home, he joined the family firm. He got extremely busy at the firm, especially when his father left to become a U.S. Supreme Court justice. So Junior left and went to Washington, D.C. The times that George could get up to Whitefish Lake were getting farther and few between, and he could only get up for maybe a few weeks of the year from Pittsburgh. But he liked to hunt and he loved deer. And so what he decided to do was that there were game laws coming on and people were not hunting year-round. They weren't hunting at night. So he'd see deer at the slough, and he decided he would try to take their photograph. He had a new hobby, and his new hobby was photography. The first camera he brought up there was a landscape camera, and was what he had at the time and what he used back home, taking pictures of family. Everyone had to be quite still when the picture was taken. This was a camera that had no shutter mechanism. You simply took the lens cap off. The plates, the glass plates were slow. In the back, it was one that you had to have a tripod for because the camera could shake. You needed long exposures. This was the 1880s, and it really wasn't the kind of camera that you should use if you want to take a picture of an animal that moved and be as fleet as a deer. The next year he came back and he got no pictures. He didn't get any pictures with his first camera. He came back the next year with a Schmid detective camera. Now this was a detective camera, so-called, because it was the first handheld camera. You could pull it out quickly. Supposedly could be a detective taking pictures of a in surveillance. But the idea was that it wasn't a camera that you really had to stand still for, and could work in lower light conditions. It worked okay. He got some images, but many of them were quite blurry. They didn't quite work out very well. What he found was that he needed to get closer to the animals. And what he found was that he needed to separate himself from the deer. That the deer would not get close to the camera because even though he was in a blind or trying to conceal himself so he could be close to the camera to snap the shutter, the deer would smell him or see him and they wouldn't get close. So what he did was he put a string onto the front of the camera and put it through eye hooks on trees and got himself, 50, 60 yards away from the camera. And then when a deer would go by, he would, try to take their picture. And he wrote, "Whenever a deer passed in front of the camera, a sharp whistle by the operator would cause it to stop. The approach of the deer to the focus point of the camera gave all the tenseness of feelings provided by hunting, but the cord was pulled instead of the trigger." George was camera hunting, and that's what he really called it. To him, it was not wildlife photography. He was hunting with a camera. And occasionally this worked quite well. This is a picture called The Three Sitters, and one of his more well-known bird pictures. And what he did was he saw these cedar waxwings flying back and forth in front of the camera. He set a dead branch out there and waited until the birds alighted on the branch, and then was able to snap this picture. And he pre-focused it as well. Now, he entered his pictures. It was probably 3 or 4 years of taking photographs, 3 or 4 summers, where he was experimenting with his techniques, getting better at it. And he entered the pictures in Forest and Stream's photography contest. Now, Forest and Stream was an important magazine at that time. It was edited by George Bird Grinnell, who was a well-known conservationist, anthropologist, and also someone who started the Audubon movement. Grinnell was worried, as were a lot of people at that time, that game was disappearing, that birds were disappearing, and that overhunting was a problem, particularly not just sportsmen overhunting, but overhunting by market hunters, people who killed animals in order to sell them, which was legal at the time. So he wanted to promote photography as much as much as hunting. And so he had this contest. George III entered, and he won the contest. And one of the judges for the contest at that time was Theodore Roosevelt. Now, George had some success in daylight, but he still had a hard time getting close to those deer. So he came back to camp one year and decided they would try to go out at night because he remembered those nights of fire hunting. And back then, the way that you lit a scene was using flash powder that you put into a tray. It was quite bright. It could flare up, and for just a moment, like an old flash bulb, it could light up the area. Now, flash powder was dangerous stuff, and it was kind of a pyrotechnic display. You had to be careful with it, but it was in use for a long time. Flash bulbs weren't invented up until the 1930s. So this was the technique that George came up with, and he took this picture himself to illustrate his technique. And I'll explain this a bit, and then we'll get into more detail. George would take a skiff out, and these were his cameras that he put on the front of the skiff. They're located in a box that he could swivel. The device on the top of the box is the parabolic lantern. So instead of having a frying pan with heartwood and birch in it, you basically had this thing. And again, hunters were using this to spot deer. And then the instrument in his hand is the powder and the flashlight itself. Now, the problem was that it was difficult to get this operation to work right. The very first time he tried it, he had flash powder, but he didn't have a good tray. So he took a dinner plate and put the flash powder in it. He put an oily rag in for a fuse, and they went out. And they saw lots of deer. They saw several deer over the course of 2 days, but they got no pictures. And later in the summer, when they did get some pictures, they were blurry, underexposed, and they just didn't work very well. George remembered this when this period when he wrote a piece for Outdoor Life, and he said, "I have amusing pictures, deer with 2 heads, some with 8 legs, some in the air with half the body missing, and some plunging into deep water with the spray more conspicuous than the deer." The problem was with synchronization. He had to have the flash go off at the exact moment that the shutter opened. And if he didn't do that, then of course, he wouldn't have enough light for his picture. It would be underexposed. So the big problem was syncing the camera, and this was a problem that they had to solve. Now, what he did was he invented this, and this was his first patent that he took out, and this was a flashlight mechanism. He took basically a metal pillbox and created a trigger and a fuse where he could put his flash powder in, pull the trigger, and he had a little shield for his face, but because again, this could be dangerous. The flashlight took a while to develop, and these were his inventions and his assistant's invention. I'll mention him in a minute. The cameras are what really were things that he could buy that were getting better and better all the time, particularly this lens here. This was the Bosch & Lomb Unicum lens. It had a leaf shutter right in the lens itself. It could stop down to f/28, which meant that there was a deep depth of field. A lot of things could be in focus just from a few inches to infinity. It had pretty good speed settings of 1/100th of a second, which could definitely stop action. And the optics were pretty good as well. Again, the cameras often got damaged. They got wet when they were out in the canoes and the skiffs, but if you could salvage the lens, that's where most of the good technology was. Now, this guy, John Hammer, became his assistant during this period, and John Hammer worked out at the camp at Whitefish Lake. And Hammer was a Swedish immigrant in Marquette. He had worked at an optical works in the old country, and he came up with some inventions along with Shiras that really improved everything. This is the pistol flashlight. I don't have a patent on this one, so we think that this was probably developed by both Shiras and by Hammer. But the flash powder was put into that round tube at the very beginning. It was sort of a gun that used a blank .22 cartridge, and then the lever on the top would trick the flash, excuse me, would trip the flash when they pulled the trigger. Excuse me. This was a much better device, and when it worked beautifully. And Shiras wrote about this, and he said that when the flash went off, quote, "A white wave of light breaks out from the bow of the boat. Deer, hills, trees, everything stands out for an instant in the white gale of the noonday. A dull report, and then a veil of inky darkness descends." The flash would go off quite bright. It was dark, of course, blackout before it went out, and it would scare the animals. That owl fell off that branch into the river. It was okay, it made its way to shore. This beaver got his picture taken. He never came back again, and neither did this deer. There was a rumor from hunters around Whitefish Lake that out at Whitefish Lake, the deer were quite spooked and often were hard to approach. And that was because they were being flashed by George Shiras with his device. But again, when it works, sometimes the images were extremely beautiful. This is a picture he called Innocents Abroad. As he got these photographs during the 1890s, and there was no one else doing this kind of work, he packaged them into a series of photographs, a set called the Midnight Series of Wild Game Photographs. And he made a lot of money with these pictures over the years. He sold them in sets at recreation shows and art galleries. He probably made about $500,000 in today's money. And eventually they were entered in the World's Fair in 1900, where they won a gold medal and got George quite a bit of notoriety. And as well, that photography contest back in Forest and Stream was getting him notoriety too. Now, as he was doing some of the photography from the skiff, and he and Hammer were creating these devices, they decided that they would try to do this on shore. And George remembered a device, he called it an infernal machine, called a set gun. And a set gun was basically, just like it sounds, it was a gun often used by trappers set up to shoot small animals, maybe a 22 rifle or pistol. Let me go back. And George thought, well, maybe I can do that with a camera using tripwires. So he came up with what was he called it the camera trap. Now, he often used 3 and 4 cameras at a time for redundancy purposes. So if one didn't work, the other one did. He set up tripwires. He knew the habits of animals quite well and would put these wires maybe an inch or 2 off the ground. And sometimes they were strings, not just wires. He would put salt down, sometimes bait down, or put them on a game trail where the animal would just run into it. He used all kinds of cameras for this. Again, these were cameras where the lenses were interchangeable, so he could take out those Unicom lenses. The cameras often got wet or got damaged, but the real technology, again, was in the lens. Now, the same thing is he had problems. the synchronization was the problem with this as well. What he first did was he would set these cameras out in the dark, and he would put tripwires down or bait them, and then he would take off the lens cap and open up the shutter. It was dark, the plates were slow, not that light sensitive, so he could walk away, and then if the animal came by, tripped the wire, the flash went off, the image would be taken, the shutter would still be open, but it would be dark. And then he could come back at night, put the lens cap back on, and then leave. But that meant staying up all night. It meant retrieving the camera shortly after the picture was taken. He was looking for a way to automate the process and make it easier. So they first started using rubber bands trying to connect the shutter mechanism to the flashlight. And what Hammer came up with was an air pump. And then that mechanism became very reliable. And just like Shiras had done earlier, they patented it. And this is 1903 patent. The idea was that maybe they could sell these or get other people to be interested in what they were doing. The fact is they never really were able to market these things because as much as the photography was beautiful, it wasn't easy. You had to know the habits of animals. You had to know a lot of the technology. And he had many attempts that didn't work very well. This is a schematic. And there were other devices they came up with too. They had to build their own stuff. Again, no one else was doing this. Shiras was quite willing. He wasn't trying to make money doing this. He was quite willing to share some of his technology. And there were others around the country that did try doing this as well. It took a lot of time to do this, and they had to practice. This is Hammer in the back, Shiras in the front, using a white card. This is another shot of them setting up in the wintertime out at Whitefish Lake. Another shot of them setting up. They took a lot of test shots in order to get what they needed. But when it came out, this was a raccoon they took at Whitefish Lake that was pulling on a piece of meat that they had tied onto it. George always liked albino deer, and whenever there was an opportunity to take pictures of albino animals, he did. Now, this picture is one of his most iconic images, and what he was trying to do was that often when he would sneak up on these animals, or if he had put something on the ground for them to eat and trip the wire, they weren't necessarily looking or in movement. They weren't looking at the camera, they weren't in movement. So he put up two flashes. The first one, they would trip the wire, the flash would go off, which would set the animals in motion. And then the next flash would go off immediately afterward, as well as the camera, and catch them in action. This is one of his more iconic images. You still see this picture used a lot. Now, what they would do is they would go off, they would set these cameras up. This is a houseboat that was on Whitefish Lake. Of course, this is in the winter. The boat was pulled up on shore. They spent Thanksgiving there and went out and set cameras up. But what they would typically do is they would set the cameras up, stay in the houseboat in the summer, or go back in the woods someplace, maybe make a fire, and wait until they heard the flashes go off. George wrote this about that. Lying beside a blazing campfire that accentuates the darkness of the night, the sportsman may suddenly see a dazzling column of light on a distant hillside. The deep, dull boom of the exploding powder a few seconds later raises a mental vision of an animal fleeing in needless terror from a bulletless weapon. Now, George was, again, always promoting camera hunting. He said this: every camera hunter must see that a more immediate, lasting pleasure is afforded and raking a running deer from stem to stern with his 5x7 bore camera than driving an ounce ball through the heart at 100 yards. George never gave up hunting itself, but he was advocating for camera work all his life. Now, to talk a little bit about his other achievements, he was a lawyer back in Pittsburgh. He served in the Pennsylvania legislature, and then he ran for Congress in 1903 as part of the Republican Party reform movement in Pittsburgh. And it was an exciting time because Theodore Roosevelt was president. There were a lot of things happening, particularly with the outdoors. When George was in Washington, when he moved to Washington, D.C., he joined the Boone and Crockett Club, which had been started by George Bird Grinnell and Theodore Roosevelt. And one night he showed his pictures there as lantern slides, and a young editor of National Geographic magazine, Gilbert Grosvenor, saw those images and asked Shiras to bring some of his pictures over to the office. Now, National Geographic at that time was not doing well. It was a small magazine. It had just a staff of 3. It was text-oriented. It had just ran its first picture in the previous month, and actually Grosvenor got some guff from some of the people who were on the board of directors. They thought he was trying to turn it into a picture magazine. But Grosvenor decided that photography was going to be important in the future and that he needed to get more subscribers. So he bought all of the pictures pretty much that George brought over. And by this time in 1903, Shiras again had a bit of a national reputation, and he had accumulated a lot of photographs, not just in Michigan, but also in Florida, where he had a winter home near Ormond Beach, and also Ontario and other places that he had gone and taken his cameras. The pictures were a sensation. The subscription list went up. It became, National Geographic became from this moment on a magazine that ran photographs and ran beautiful photographs of nature and wildlife. And the very first pictures in the magazine of wildlife were from George Shiras. It created a long relationship with Shiras. Now, when he was in Congress, he also was on the Public Lands Committee. He was the only Easterner on the Public Lands Committee, which was an exciting committee to be on because Roosevelt was setting aside a lot of land at that time through national forest and through national parks. The other thing that George did as a congressman, which was extremely important, was his introduction of a bill to protect migratory birds. It was called back then the Shiras Bird Bill, and it was designed to protect game birds, birds that ducks, brants, geese, birds that typically were hunted and that moved from between state to state in their migration routes. Now, the problem was that there were no national hunting seasons on these birds. They were literally shot year-round, and they were also hunted for the market as well. Now, why were people so worried about birds then? Well, they were disappearing. This was a picture of a passenger pigeon, which was the last bastion of really the passenger pigeon was northern Michigan. The passenger pigeons were the most abundant bird probably ever on the earth, and used to darken the skies. People never thought they would go away, but they disappeared, as had the buffalo out on the Great Plains. There were a lot of animals that were in low numbers. And again, part of it was market hunting, or there were people who would go out and shoot hundreds of ducks and other game animals for the market. There were contests where people in a town would go out and shoot every animal over a 24-hour period and see who got the most critters. And there was this as well, that many animals were being hunted for their feathers, many of their fur or their feathers. Women at that time all had to have a feather in their hat or even a stuffed bird. This is a letter that I discovered in my research from Theodore Roosevelt to Shiras, basically thanking him for the bird bill and saying how glad he was that we have a man in Congress who cares about birds and about nature generally. Now, he said that George had created quite a relationship with National Geographic magazine. He did a whole series of stories over the next 20 years for the magazine. This one was about an albino raccoon that he spent 4 or 5 years watching around Whitefish Lake. He also got to know quite a few famous naturalists who were going on expeditions, people from the Natural History Museum in New York, the Smithsonian Institution. He went along as the photographer. His equipment was getting better. This was a handheld Graflex that he was using. Again, he would often put it on the front of his boat, but then he could easily get off with it and take photographs as well. This is a picture of John Hammer in Newfoundland, and you can see that Shiras still has his other camera in the front of his boat. Those are his glass plates in the middle, but this was taken from the shoreline. The faster shutter speeds enabled him to stop action. He's the first photographer to take a picture of a bird on the wing. This was taken in Louisiana. And he made 3 different trips to Yellowstone National Park. He was interested in finding moose. Now, moose were pretty much unknown south of the Canadian border. They had been extirpated by overhunting, and literally a moose had not been seen for many years. Now, the Yellowstone National Park at that time was not yet, it was a park, but there was no U.S. Park Service. There was no biology going on. It was looked over by the military, and the military was simply trying to keep out the poachers. On the bottom right-hand corner, this is Yellowstone Lake. On the bottom right-hand corner is the southeast arm of the lake, and this is the upper Yellowstone River. There was a report that moose had been seen in that area, and so George and Hammer made 3 different trips to get up there. And when they did, they found hundreds of moose living in a kind of splendid isolation. Shiras took a lot of photographs on that trip. He ran an article in Forest and Stream and also in National Geographic. What he noticed was those moose were a little bit different. They were smaller, they had maybe a darker color. They looked a little different than the kind of moose that he had seen in the eastern United States and in Canada. And indeed, when one of these moose was collected and brought back to Washington to the Biological Survey, they determined that it was a separate subspecies of moose. So the Rocky Mountain moose today is known as the Shiras moose. So if you go to Yellowstone Park and you see a moose, you're looking at Alces americana shirasi, the Shiras moose. George was well known by this time. When he left Congress after he only wanted to serve 1 term because he wanted to take photographs. He said that he wanted to study the laws of nature instead of the laws of man. And he was wealthy enough from his own family fortune, the Peter White fortune, and from the sale of his photographs to do really whatever he wanted. So he went to Alaska twice. Again, these were expeditions with National Geographic. His exploits were often followed in the newspapers and the wire services. He went to Panama in 1913 to take photographs of the filling of the Panama Canal. The canal was pretty much done. They were filling the water up, and as they were doing that, they were isolating animals onto hillsides that became islands and mountains that became islands. And so George went down there to collect some specimens for some museums and also to take photographs. This picture is taken in a bat cave with one of the guides holding the flashlight. All this time, though, he was advocating for the bird bill. The bird bill did not pass when he introduced it, and the reason it was that it was controversial. It was, for a lot of folks, it was a federal grab of power over the states, that the states should have the right to set their own seasons and that the birds did not belong to the federal government. George is really the architect of the legal justification for doing just that. Now, what happened during this period was that he made a lot of speeches. This was a pamphlet that he wrote that was given out to politicians. And what also became evident by this time was that the birds were disappearing. Something had to be done. And by 1912, the act passed as the Weeks-McLean Act. And it passed partly because the legal work that George had done, but also that enough congressmen were convinced that many animal species were just going to disappear unless something was done. So this set hunting seasons, bag limits. It outlawed spring hunting when the birds were coming north for nesting season. You couldn't shoot them. It outlawed market hunting, and it outlawed the hunting for feathers. And even by that time, a lot of this, partly because of the Audubon movement, feathers on women's hats had gone out of fashion, and that made a big difference too. George was on the advisory board to help the Department of Agriculture implement the law. Eventually, this went to a treaty that with Mexico and Canada. Shiras, and it was the state of Missouri, the state of Louisiana, and some of the southern states that made a lot of money from market hunting fought this. It went up to the Supreme Court. Shiras helped write the court briefs, and it extended protection to all of North America. So this is really one of his stunning achievements as a conservationist outside of his photography. He was honored in 1919 as an eminent naturalist. This is a picture of Shiras on the right, Theodore Roosevelt second from the left. Both of them were honored at a college in Connecticut as being important naturalists. Shiras and Roosevelt had become quite good friends over the years, often saw each other, and this was the last time that they met. Roosevelt was not in good shape. He had some serious health issues, plus his son had been killed in World War I. He took Shiras aside and he said to him, "The bullet is on its way for both of us," meaning we're getting older, and what I would like you to do is write your big book. And Roosevelt had been telling Shiras for years, you need to write a big book and put all your photographs in there and all of your adventures. And that your magazine articles, yes, are important, but you really need to write a book. Roosevelt died just a few months later. Shiras did not write his book for another 10 years, but through the 1920s became convinced that he needed to do this. He put it together in the early 1930s. It included his best photographs. The first volume is all about Michigan. The second volume is about his other expeditions that he took. It was printed by the National Geographic, sold by the National Geographic, and it did quite well. The New York Times called the book one of incomparable beauty and interest, and will stand as a monument to his devoted labor for future generations of America, of the wilderness and its native creatures. Shiras lived till 1942. He was honored in several instances. Gilbert Grosvenor wrote that those very first pictures that appeared were a pioneering achievement. It was an extraordinary educative series. Nobody had ever seen pictures of wild animals like that. I can't exaggerate the enthusiasm with which they were received by our members. Shiras' wife died in the 1930s. He came back to Marquette and northern Michigan so he could be near the camp. This is a picture where he had his initials carved onto a rock at camp, and the date 1871 being the first date that he came to Whitefish Lake. He spent 65 summers at Whitefish Lake, taking photographs, hunting, and really learning his education in wildlife, because he saw it up close. This is the camp today. This is it's still in the family. This is the Whitefish River. This is the buildings are a bit different, but they are. It's still a place Shiras would recognize. The shoreline is undeveloped, and you can still put a canoe and go up the river, as they did with those cameras late at night, and go into the open lake. And I'd be happy to take questions now. Thank you.
All right, 1 minute. Switch back to my slides here. All right. So Zach and Rob, did we have any questions come in?
Doesn't look like any questions popped up in the chat yet.
Okay.
Are there any museums or up around Marquette that have any of Shiras' pictures displayed?
The public library in town, the Peter White Public Library, on the second floor has a Shiras room, and there are a few pictures up there on the wall. And the interesting thing about that room is that it has all of his wildlife books. So his collection of books ended up in this special room in the library. You can't take them out, but you can look at them. And they're really fascinating because it shows all the people that he was in touch with. They were, and so there's a lot of signatures in the books. I even found little notes, even found some letters buried in those books that I used in some of my research.
Thank you.
Thanks. We had a couple of comments about, yeah, I do believe there was a photo in the presentation that you called it a raccoon, but I'm pretty sure that was a porcupine. The label said porcupine. Is that right?
Yeah. So I think the slide before was maybe a raccoon. The porcupine, he actually wrote an entire story on for National Geographic. He followed the porcupine for 5 or 6 years. It would come down to the shoreline. He would look for it every year. He would take pictures of it. He realized it was blind, and it also came down with its babies, and the babies, of course, were not albino. And so he wrote an interesting story about that and used a series of pictures.
Cool. Thank you. That's very interesting. And I do believe that blindness is common with albino albinism, I suppose, across species. So.
Well, George had a real fascination with albino animals, and if any of you are old enough or came to Marquette, back in the 60s or 70s, there was a Shiras Zoo, or a small enclosure out on Presque Isle outside of Marquette, and they were often filled with albino deer, and that got its start back in the 20s under George Shiras.
Mm-hmm. Cool. There's a question. It says preview of the book, lots of photo reproductions. Let me hold up my copy again. I think that's what you're asking for. Yeah, so this is the book here. Yes, thank you.
And there are photographs. They're not, you know, I would say the plates aren't, you know, this is the one of the flying deer. So there's some of the better photographs. There's actually, and I would recommend going online and typing in George Shiras' Paris exhibition. There was a hunting museum in Paris about 3 years ago that did a George Shiras exhibit. And they've got a really nice website, and you can see some of these photographs on the website, and backlit on the screen. They're really quite beautiful.
Yeah. Very cool. I did see one more question.
And some of these photographs are also in the public domain. You can find them online. They were taken before copyright laws. And so there's actually a few posters, and you can buy some of these from different places.
Yep. And I believe you mentioned in the book too that he left mostly his entire collection to the National Geographic Society. Is that right?
That's right. So he left all of his best negatives to the Geographic Society. Several hundred of them. They occasionally run some when they're doing some historical piece about the history of the magazine. They're glass plates. I got some original scans that I paid for from those glass plates, and then I've turned around and blowing those up. And because the glass plate is 5x7, the enlargements are really extraordinary.
Yeah,
quite nice.
I can imagine. Did any of the hunters in the area strongly object to the camera hunting, saying that that was harmful to the animals?
Well, what they found was there was a complaint that it was, and again, a lot of people were hunting using this jacklight method where they were going out. Their jack-lanterns got a little, or jacklights got a little better, where they had a parabolic mirror. So they would go along these railroad tracks north of Whitefish Lake, shine their parabolic, jacklight into the woods. They saw a pair of eyes, they would shoot at it. And George talks about how that was a dangerous thing to do because whose eyes were you lighting up? But that's how a lot of these hunters would hunt them. The hunters said they had a very hard time doing this around Whitefish Lake. And that's because the animals had been flashed by George first. And so they ran away. But a lot of what he was doing out there was a mystery to the local people. They didn't quite know what was going on. They were hearing these odd explosions in the woods. When these flashes went off, they sounded like a mortar. The deer was physically scared by the percussion, and the animal would turn around, run into a tree. Sometimes if it was a bird, it would be so scared or blinded, it would fall onto the ground. So, in Yellowstone, he had a grizzly come in one night, and he put a little extra powder in because he knew it was a grizzly, and it made an enormous explosion and scared the grizzly away. But he still got a picture of it.
Nice.
So people really weren't aware quite what was happening, but there was something spooky and weird happening out there. And some of these flashes at night could be seen 20 miles away.
Yeah, that's hard to imagine. I've, as a photographer as well, I'm aware of the progression of flash photography, but I think it's hard for us to imagine the flash on cameras today and compare that to an actual flash explosion, in the early 19th century.
It depended on how much powder you had, and he got burned a few times. He injured his hand. It could be a dangerous thing, without a doubt. And though he was known to be quite good at this, but he got quite good over time.
Mm-hmm. So there was a question about the location of the the Whitefish Lake, which I know there was a map in your presentation, and someone did do a link, but can you kind of describe how one might find Whitefish Lake?
The Whitefish Lake, you'll cross it on Route 28 when you drive between Marquette and Munising. You'll go through a little place called Deerton, and Whitefish Lake is about 6 miles inland down a dirt road that is called the Peter White Road. You can't get to the camp, and you actually can't get to the lake right now, but you can get to the Nature Conservancy reserve that is near there, and you can walk on a trail which is called the George III Discovery Trail, and then you can kind of look over at the camp. But the family just this year put up the rest of the property for sale. And so I think they're asking about $1 million for 300 acres to camp, and that would give you access to the lake. So you can't come here right now and put a canoe in and go up to the lake and see it.
Is that because of the snow or just because of the access?
Because of the access.
Okay.
And the snow, the snow right now, you probably have a hard time getting the last 2 miles down the road to where the camp is, or where the Laughing Whitefish Preserve is. So there's different parts of the Laughing Whitefish River between the lake and going north to Lake Superior. The Laughing Whitefish empties into Lake Superior. There's some different areas that are preserved. This one has not been yet.
Yeah. All right, we're gonna do, I guess, 2 more questions. Can you talk about the process for preserving glass plates, the glass plate negatives?
Well, as I understand it, these negatives are in extremely good condition today. You put emulsion on these glass plates. It got to the point that he never had to do that himself. He could buy glass plates that already had the emulsion on it. They were developed pretty much like negatives were. If they're well protected and they're kept away from bright sunlight, they can work really well. So the ones in the National Geographic Archives are in excellent condition. You can go online today, you can go to the National Archives and you can order prints made from glass negatives from the Civil War. So they do keep pretty well.
Okay. And I believe, I don't recall from the book, did George Shiras III visit the Keweenaw and take any photos up there?
In the Keweenaw, I don't see photos from the Keweenaw, no. He did go into the Huron Mountain Club. He knew people there, so that's northwest of Marquette. He liked to go to Grand Island. Grand Island at that time was owned by the Cleveland Cliffs Iron Company. They had tried to turn it into a game preserve. They brought all kinds of exotic animals, exotic at least from North America. So they brought caribou there. They brought elk and other critters there, and with the idea that they were going to make it what they called a little Yellowstone, and that they would have a tourist hotel. They had gamekeepers. The whole thing was a flop. The animals did not do well there. It wasn't their habitat. A wolf got onto the island, chased most of the caribou off a cliff, but there were several years there where George could go out and take some of his pictures there. So a couple of his nice moose pictures are taken on Grand Island. He also went to Ontario. He went to Mexico. He did a lot of work in Florida. Of course, he went to Panama. So Central America and North America was really the places that he went, and Alaska.
Okay. Well, very cool. And I know you put the link earlier, but can you put a link also in the chat box again about how one might get a hold of this book if they wanted to read it?
I did at the very top here. So if you look at the very top, I had purchased quite a few books because I was going to be going out on a Michigan Notable Book Tour before, of course, COVID hit, and which I would have been traveling to some different libraries around the state. So I have books here because I wasn't able to sell those books. So I put my email up here. It's Jim McCommons at nmu.edu. You can look me up on the internet, Google me, and the books are $25, and they're also available in bookstores. You can ask your local bookstore to order it, although some of the bookstores may have it because it was a Michigan Notable book. And if you do Kindle, you can also download it from Amazon.
Cool. Yeah, I did copy that there at the bottom so people don't have to scroll all the way up there. So, okay. Well, thank you very much, Jim, for your time tonight. Also, if people, have further questions about the book, I'm sure you wouldn't mind them emailing you as well. You're getting some applause. So yeah, the book is Camera Hunter. It's a good read, and it's available all over. So I want to remind everyone, thank you again, Jim, and thank you everyone for joining us. And remind you all that this is just the first of a series of virtual presentations that we're putting on, Michigan Nature is putting on this year, called Michigan Nature at Home. Our next presentation is Thursday, February 11th. We'll hear from Greg Bodker. He is a noted birder in the state and a two-time winner of M&A's annual photo contest. So thank you all again. Have a great evening, and we hope to see you again soon.
Take care.